At least her baby has a father. The words sliced through the air. Sharp and deliberate. My mother, Patricia, didn't whisper them. She announced them. A champagne flute raised in a mockery of a toast. The room, filled with Charleston's elite, fell into a hush that felt heavier than the crystal chandeliers above us, before I could even breathe. My Aunt Susan chimed in with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Unlike her sister's bastard child. I froze. My hands tightened around the handles of the small, simple gift bag I was holding. But before I could move, before I could swallow the rage rising in my throat, my 9-year-old son, Mason, stepped forward. He didn't look back at me. He walked straight toward Patricia with a calmness that terrified me. I got something for you. Grandma, he said, his voice steady. Dad told me to give you this. Before I tell you what was inside that bag, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The setting was perfect for a public execution, though nobody knew it yet. We were at the Biltmore Estate Conservatory, surrounded by orchids that cost more than my first car, and people who valued their net worth more than their souls. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. I stood near the kitchen doors, at the overflow table assigned to me, watching waiters maneuver trays of hors d'oeuvres around guests who wouldn't even make eye contact with them. Or with me. My sister, Ashley, was holding court in the center of the room, her maternity gown shimmering under the lights. It was a display of aggressive wealth, a fortress built to keep people like me out. But as a landscape architect, I couldn't help but notice the details they missed. The hydrangeas in the centerpieces were wilting at the edges. The soil in the potted palms was dry. The roots were rotting beneath the surface. It was a perfect metaphor for my family, shiny on the outside, decaying from within. Generational photo, the photographer called out, his voice echoing in the glass dome. Direct line only. Please! I hesitated, then took Mason's hand and stepped forward. We were family. We were blood. But Patricia was there instantly, her hand resting heavily on Mason's shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. Not you, sweetie, she whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. This is for the legitimate line. Why don't you go sit with the catering staff? I'm sure they have some juice for you. She physically blocked him from the frame, her back turning to us as she smiled for the camera. Mason didn't cry. He didn't look at me for comfort. He just gripped his gift bag tighter, his knuckles turning white. I should have grabbed him and left. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to protect him from this poison. But I stayed. Not because I was weak. Not because I was desperate for their approval. I stayed because of a promise, weeks ago. When the invitation arrived, I had thrown it in the trash. But Mason had fished it out. I want to go. Mom, he had said. I want to see them. I want to know who they really are. I realized then that protecting him from the truth was just another form of lying. He needed to see the cruelty for himself. He needed to understand that the defect wasn't in him, it was in them. So I stayed, biting my tongue until it tasted like copper, breaking the chain of compliance by letting him witness the monster without a filter. I wasn't submitting. I was letting them build the gallows they would hang themselves on. To them, my husband Caleb was a footnote. A nobody musician who died broke and left me with nothing but a child and a mountain of debt. That was the narrative they loved. It made them feel superior. It made my struggle a morality play they could judge from their high towers. But they didn't know Caleb. They didn't know the mind that hummed behind his quiet smile. Caleb wasn't just a musician. He was a coder. A brilliant architect of digital infrastructure who had sold his patents to a tech giant 3 years before he got sick. He never told them. Why give them a reason to be fake? He'd asked me, his eyes gleaming with a secret humor. We lived in a small rental house, drove used cars, and wore thrift store clothes. It wasn't poverty. It was camouflage. We were building a fortress of our own, brick by invisible brick. Caleb taught Mason how to read a balance sheet before he could ride a bike without training wheels. He taught him that real power doesn't shout, it waits. Wealth is a tool. Morgan, Caleb would say, sitting at our kitchen table covered in blueprints and ledgers. Not a costume. So after he died, I kept the costume on. I drove the beat-up sedan. I lived in the rental. I let them believe I was drowning because it kept them from asking for money. It kept Mason safe from their greed. Back in the conservatory, Aunt Susan drifted past me, her eyes raking over my simple dress. Still wearing that old thing? She sniffed. I suppose it's charming. in a rustic sort of way, though I'd be embarrassed to show my face in shoes like that. I looked down at my shoes. They were sensible, comfortable, and they were standing on ground she didn't know I owned. I watched Patricia and Ashley laughing across the room, clinking glasses with reckless abandon. And suddenly, it clicked. The frantic energy, the obsession with appearances, the way Patricia's hand shook slightly when she reached for her wine. They weren't just mean. They were terrified. I analyzed them like I would a failing landscape project. The cruelty was a distraction. They were projecting their own failure onto me. If I was the disaster, then they were the success. If I was the bastard's mother, then they were the royalty. They needed me to be broken so no one would notice the cracks in their own foundation. The realization washed over me with the clarity of ice water. They weren't powerful. They were bankrupt. And they were using my humiliation as a shield to hide their own ruin. The speeches began, and the air in the room grew thick with self-congratulation. Patricia took the microphone, her diamonds catching the light, blinding and sharp. She looked out at the crowd, a queen surveying her subjects, oblivious to the fact that her throne was made of paper. "We are so blessed," she began, her voice trembling with a performance of emotion. "To have a daughter who understands duty, who understands legacy." She turned to Ashley, beaming. "Ashley, you have made us so proud. You married well. You secured the future of this family. You didn't just follow your heart. You followed your head." The swipe was clumsy and brutal. A direct hit at me. The daughter who married for love and ended up a widow in a rental. The guests shifted in their seats, a ripple of uncomfortable laughter moving through the room. Patricia didn't notice, or didn't care. Her hubris was a blinding light, shielding her from the reality of her own cruelty. She believed she was untouchable. She believed this was her domain. And I was just a prop in her play. And to know that this baby, she continued, gesturing to Ashley's stomach, will carry on the true, legitimate line. It brings peace to my heart. She paused for effect, raising her glass. At least this baby has a father. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the respectful silence of a toast. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. And then, from the side, Aunt Susan's voice cut through the void, loud and slurred, unlike her sister's bastard child. The word hung there, suspended in the humidity of the greenhouse. Bastard. I saw guests look down at their plates. I saw a waiter freeze, tray in hand. But no one spoke. No one stood up. No one said, "That's enough." And that silence was the final seal. They thought they had won. They thought they had crushed me into dust. They didn't see the little boy standing up from his chair. They didn't see him straighten his jacket. They didn't see the soldier stepping onto the battlefield. Mason walked to the front of the room. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He moved with a precision that belonged to a boardroom, not a playground. The click of his dress shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. A metronome counting down to their destruction. He stopped in front of Patricia. She looked down at him, her lip curling in a sneer, expecting a crayon drawing or a tearful plea for affection. She was ready to perform her benevolence, to pat his head and dismiss him back to the catering table. "I got something for you, Grandma," he said, his voice carrying to the back rows without a tremor. "Dad told me to give you this." He handed her the bag. She took it with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. She reached inside and pulled out not a piece of paper, but a sleek, black digital tablet. She frowned, turning it over in her hands, confused by the weight of it. Mason didn't wait for her to ask questions. He reached up and pressed the screen. The video began to play. The sound was amplified, booming through the speakers I had quietly connected to the Bluetooth system minutes before. The feedback whine cut through the air, followed by a voice that made half the room gasp. Caleb's face filled the screen. He looked tired, the illness already carving hollows into his cheeks and graying his skin. But his eyes were sharp, piercing. There was no fear in them, only calculation. "Hello, Patricia." Caleb's voice filled the room. It wasn't a ghost. It was a judgment. "If you're watching this, it means you've treated my son like trash. Again." Patricia gasped, nearly dropping the tablet. The guests leaned forward, the collective breath of 300 people held in suspension. The waiters stopped serving. The air conditioning seemed to hum louder in the silence. "You always thought I was a loser," Caleb continued, his voice calm, conversational, like he was discussing the weather and not an execution. A nobody musician. You told Morgan she was throwing her life away. You told her I couldn't provide. You told her I was a dead end. He leaned closer to the camera, the lens focusing on the intensity of his gaze. I didn't want to correct you. I wanted to protect my family from you, but I knew I was dying. And I knew that once I was gone, you would come for them. You would try to break them to make yourself feel tall. On the screen, Caleb shifted, picking up a stack of papers. Blue legal binders, so I didn't just leave them money. Patricia, I bought your leverage. He held up a document to the camera. The stamp of the bank was clearly visible. The account numbers were redacted. But the property address was not. 6 months ago, your bank put your distressed mortgage portfolio up for sale. You were in default. You were drowning. You leveraged this estate to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford, hoping Ashley would marry rich enough to bail you out. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The golden cage wasn't just rotting, it was leveraged to the hilt. I bought the debt, Caleb said. All of it. Through a shell company you never bothered to investigate because you were too busy mocking my shoes. He dropped the binder on the desk in the video with a heavy thud. I own your mortgage. I own your estate. I own the roof over your head. And the terms of the loan give the note holder the right to accelerate payment upon evidence of financial insolvency. This isn't a gift, Caleb said, his eyes locking onto hers through the screen, traversing time and death to deliver the final blow. It's a foreclosure notice. And Mason? He's the beneficiary. The screen went black. The silence that followed was louder than the video. It was a physical weight, pressing down on every person in the room. The shame was absolute. Patricia stood frozen, her face a mask of horror, the tablet slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot, signaling the end of her reign. That's a lie, Patricia stammered, her voice cracking, stripping away the polished veneer of the society matriarch. She pointed a shaking finger at the blank screen of the tablet lying on the floor. It's a fake video. A deep fake. You unstable. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and frantic, begging the crowd to side with her, to laugh it off, to restore the order where she was the queen and I was the peasant. But no one was laughing. The silence was curdling into something else judgment. Security, she shrieked, her composure fracturing completely. Get them out. They are disrupting my daughters. The double doors at the back of the conservatory burst open, slamming against the walls with a violence that made the crystal glassware rattle. It wasn't security. The head event planner rushed in, her face flushed a blotchy red, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield against an incoming airstrike. She didn't look at the guests. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked straight at Patricia with the desperate intensity of someone whose bottom line just vanished. Mrs. Sterling, she called out, breathless, ignoring the decorum of the event. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a major problem. The credit cards on file. All of them. They've been declined. A gasp rippled through the crowd, starting from the front row and washing back like a tide. In Charleston society, scandal was currency, but financial insolvency was a death sentence. What are you talking about? Patricia hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, trying to regain control. Run them again. We did, the planner said, her voice rising in panic, loud enough for the investment bankers at table 4 to hear every syllable. We ran the Amex, the Visa, and the backup line. The bank has frozen the assets, the transaction for the catering, the venue, the staff. The $75,000 balance hasn't cleared. She took a step closer, dropping her voice only slightly, but in the acoustic perfection of the glass dome, it was audible to everyone. We can't continue service. The kitchen is packing up. I can't pay my staff with declined authorizations. The illusion shattered. The golden cage dissolved into rust right before our eyes. Patricia looked around wildly, seeking an ally, a savior, anyone who would step in and validate her status. She looked at Aunt Susan, who was suddenly very interested in the pattern of the tablecloth. She looked at Ashley, who dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the marble, the sound like a gunshot signaling the end of the war. Do you have a backup card? The planner asked, desperate, holding out the payment terminal. Anyone? Patricia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was bankrupt, exposed, naked in front of the very people she lived to impress. The emperor had no clothes. and her debt had finally come due. Then, a small, calm voice cut through the chaos. My mom can pay. Mason stepped forward again. He didn't look smug. He looked like he was closing a deal. He looked at the planner. Then at his grandmother. But you have to leave. I walked up to the planner. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't acknowledge the whispers that were now a roar of gossip. I knelt and picked up the tablet from the floor. I tapped the screen, bringing up the banking app Caleb had set up years ago, the one that held the proceeds from his patents. The one that had been compounding interest while I drove a 10-year-old car. I'll cover the vendor costs, I said to the planner. My voice cool. Detached. I won't have the staff lose their wages because of her insolvency. I tapped the transfer button. The terminal in the planner's hand beeped. Approved. The planner slumped in relief. Thank you. Ma'am. Thank you. I turned to Patricia. She was trembling, her hands grasping at the air as if trying to catch the remnants of her reputation. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single, folded document. The paper was heavy. Legal bond. I unfolded it slowly. You called my son a bastard, I said, my voice low, for her ears only, though the silence in the room meant everyone heard it anyway. You tried to erase him, but Caleb made sure you couldn't. I held up the document. This is the deed to the estate. It is held in the Mason-Caleb Trust. I am the executor. I stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look at me, really look at me for the first time in her life. You're trespassing, I said, and effective immediately. You are evicted. I didn't stay for the shouting. I didn't stay for the tears or the bargaining or the desperate attempts to rewrite history in the span of 30 seconds. I signaled the security team hired by me weeks ago, standing by in the vestibule for this exact moment, and they moved in. Please escort Mrs. Sterling and her daughter off the premises, I said, turning my back on them. The guests parted like the Red Sea, a mix of horror and fascination on their faces as security guided a sobbing Patricia and a stunned, silent Ashley toward the exit. They didn't fight. They were too broken by the public execution to fight. The shame was absolute, a stain that would never wash out of their silk dresses. I took Mason's hand. It was warm and steady. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, the shadow was gone from his eyes. Ready to go home? I asked. Yeah, he said. Let's go. We walked out of the conservatory, past the wilting hydrangeas, past the silent crowd of Charleston's elite who were witnessing the fall of a dynasty, into the cool night air. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me anymore. 6 months later, the winter sun streamed through the windows of our new home. It wasn't a rental. It wasn't hidden. It was ours. A house filled with light, with plants that thrived because they were cared for, with air that felt clean. Patricia was living in a small condo on the outskirts of town, her social standing reduced to ash. The bankruptcy was public, messy, and final. Ashley's husband had filed for divorce the week after the wedding debacle, citing irreconcilable financial deception. The golden child was now just another woman with a mountain of debt and a reputation in tatters. I stood in the kitchen, watching Mason play in the backyard. He wasn't carrying the weight of the world anymore. He wasn't trying to earn his place. He was just a boy, chasing a dog, laughing into the wind. Family isn't who you're born with. It's who you die for. It's the people who build fortresses around you when you are vulnerable, who protect your peace when you cannot. Caleb built ours from the grave, weaving a safety net of steel and foresight. Mason defended it with a single, brave sentence, and I was the architect who finally closed the gate, locking out the monsters for good. If you've ever had to build your own family from scratch, share this story. You are the architect of your own peace.